yesterday. I'm sorry that I can't meet you all face to face, but I'm sure there'll be another time. So I'm doing a presentation which I've got to give a little bit of thanks out first. One to Amanda Ferrente from EBSCO, who I think you heard from earlier on today, who's been working very closely with the librarians at Chalmers, who I also thank for their work on the integration with FOLIO and OpenAthens. Now, for those that don't know, FOLIO is a library services platform. It's an open source platform that's in Genesis at the moment. And the very first library that went live with this was Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg. And of course, what we want to do is speak to the decisions that were made by the librarians at Chalmers and try and share that experience for people that are maybe thinking about moving to either OpenAthens because of its flexibility, or indeed to FOLIO with OpenAthens as the authentication piece. So in order to figure out why certain decisions were made at Chalmers, we've got to kind of look at the culture of authentication and how it's evolved over time. So I'm guessing that many people on this call will be quite familiar with the authentication conversation of recent years. But just to kind of backtrack a little, to date we've seen lots of library authentication tools that can do some, but probably not all, of what any given library might require. And they often check some of the boxes, but not all of them. And as library research moves more outside of the physical location, that becomes more and more important. And it rings true that we need to move on to possibly different tools. As library research puts more pressures on proxy servers and VPNs, we need to help library users log into those subscriptions remotely and remain anonymous while doing so. But IP access, of course, doesn't always support this automatic personalization, and in some cases, it's not such a robust user experience. So we moved on to SAML, which can support automatic personalization, of course, and also empowers patrons. But for remote users, some access points identifies them as a member of a subscribing institution. And as the library research moves more and more into the outside of the physical locations, we need to be very much more cognizant of people moving towards open web, to search engines really, and you know the normal culprits out there. And we need to really provide a system that offers valid authorized members of institutions to get access to the most important treasures of that institution. And of course, this is also one of the primary questions that the RA21 initiative aimed to address as well. I've got to remember to take the slides on. So we've now reached the point in the current phase of evolution where we've received recommendations for both authentication technology and the access point user experience, and conversations are now focusing on how best to deploy that streamlined and standardized authentication point. So we start to now think about the considerations that we look at beyond the library. And to cover this evolution that we've seen over the past few years, and also to not give everybody a history lesson, whilst also illustrating that there are lots of stakeholders involved in the decisions to migrate to a new authentication tool. It's not as simple as deciding that the access point is something that you're looking for. We no longer have the luxury of operating within the library as its own microcosm. And access is no longer a matter of the end user simply coming into the library and the librarian making information available at that particular place. Access is now subject to IT, obviously information security concerns, because that's now digital access, and it requires technology to make it happen. So we've got to observe all of these stakeholders and also the way that the industry is moving. How can we retain our relevance within the open web and within different organizations putting pressure on those end users? So it's a very complex environment that we come into. And so now the library. So from conversations about authentication that we've had in the past, it's not the simple question of asking what do you need access to. In the experience of people that I work with, both at EBSCO and in libraries, a library that's approaching any sort of an authentication tool asks about how will users get access and which users will get access. And what does access mean? What are they going to access? What are our must-haves for a user interface? Do we subscribe to platforms that require or would benefit from automatic personalization maybe? Excuse me. And there's a threshold for interoperability that we've got to meet. In a perfect world, how would our authentication be administered? Would it be robust IT presence? Well, we know that IT have got to keep payroll working and a million other functions within the institution. And of course, then someone's going to ask you about usage stats. What's being used? How's something being used? And then someone else is going to ask you about preservation of users' rights and how to protect data and how to protect identity. And so the more we look at this, the more that we need to understand the analytics that can come out so that the library can compare usage to student outcomes. So, preamble over, moving on to Chalmers. Chalmers is a Swedish university. It's got just over 98% electronic material. They moved from Sierra and Summon over to EDS and FOLIO. So that's a bit of context. When we look at what's needed for FOLIO and EDS, we need to look at the navigation of that implementation process for any software, so that those questions that I mentioned before get answered. And during Chalmers FOLIO and EDS deployment, these two questions really sparked quite a significant conversation. So who needs access to what, and how are those users going to log in? They seem very straightforward questions, but as I'm sure you're aware, anything is, there's nothing straightforward about authentication and users. So within Chalmers, these important questions became the plans for FOLIO and authentication. So it was a bit of a hiccup. It's a barrier because the questions need answering, of course. And so at Chalmers, all the enrolled students and all the employed faculty and staff have an account in the Active Directory. And this is the login screen that people can use when they come in. This is the Active Directory account. However, Chalmers has got a pretty significant proportion of the population that's the local community. They're walk-in users, people who have got the right to access Chalmers subscriptions, but they're not students, they're not faculty, and they're not staff. So in FOLIO, walk-in users could actually come in and create an account, and they create the username and password that would identify them within the FOLIO environment. And this is an important piece of the FOLIO setup. Another important piece of the puzzle was that these walk-in users should be able to log into EDS using their FOLIO accounts. And therein lies a question. If walk-in users don't have an Active Directory account, how will they log into this Active Directory page? That's a bit of a head scratcher. So the answer to this question is that they can't, of course. And walk-in users with FOLIO accounts must actually log into the FOLIO login page. So we need an authentication tool in this circumstance that can connect to Active Directory, but it can also connect to the FOLIO directory. So we're going to add another degree of complication onto this as well. To this new knowledge that we've got two separate user directories needing to authenticate into EDS and to achieve FOLIO patron empowerment, let's look at the peripheral questions. How about user groups? How do they achieve access? What about the control over data sovereignty? How do we use the data that we've got for usage reporting, statistics? And then if another tool is needed to build compatibility, how can that other tool extend beyond EDS? So the solution. Here's the breakdown of knowns. So one, Folio can store accounts for community walk-in users. This is a separate directory called, from the Chalmers Active Directory. And secondly, we've got OpenAthens can connect multiple directories to any given platform. It can act as the bridge between multiple disparate directories and also the publisher's interface. And three, when we integrate Folio, EDS and OpenAthens in this way, all users who have the right to access, regardless of whether they're a walk-in user or an enrolled student, can achieve authentication and personalization and patron empowerment. So what we're looking at here is an OpenAthens access point. OpenAthens has connected two different user directories. We've got a single access point where each type of the user can go in and choose how to log in. It's simple and it's pretty standard, and regardless of who you are, where you are, or what device you're using, it's going to work. And it also fulfills Chalmers' mandate to support access for those who have the right to have access to material. For those of you who might be interested a little bit more in how this works from a quasi-technical standpoint, we've got a couple of diagrams. And to avoid going into too many weeds, which are very necessary for me as the OpenAthens guys, who are the experts or on the other end of this call, Chalmers uses Active Directory Federated Services, which is where they house accounts belonging to their enrolled students and employed faculty and staff. And when we connect their ADFS to OpenAthens, students, faculty and staff are able to log into the library resources using their ADFS accounts. As you'll probably know, ADFS is SAML compliant, and so to connect ADFS to OpenAthens, we establish a one-to-one SAML connection and map a single user identifying attribute. And this attribute can be anything, really. It's like an ID number, targeted ID, email address. The only requirement is that it's persistent and it's unique, and it doesn't have to be personally identifiable either. And then for accounts that are housed in Folio, we leverage OpenAthens Accounts Management API to enable walk-ins. And by connecting to the Folio data store using the API, we're enabling Chalmers walk-in users to log into OpenAthens and achieve the same authentication, personalization, and patron empowerment as the other group as well. And then we have the authentication handshake shown just here, which I can confirm is working for Chalmers. Chalmers were speaking at the recent Folio Day, which was the week before last in London, and they presented on not necessarily the authentication, but on the success and experience of Folio so far within their institution. So the takeaways from this are that OpenAthens is not a required component for a Folio deployment, and also it works the other way around, but it does solve a multitude of different issues that can come up when we start thinking about who has the rights to access what and where from. Chalmers isn't a very large library, and I'm sure there are more complex libraries out there. But one of the things that this really does show is that if you think about those questions of who needs access and from where, and what groups are they affiliated with, then those questions are much better to have out in front before an implementation of Folio and OpenAthens, or indeed any other tool as well. But ultimately, we have happy end users. And here's a photo of Chalmers University Library. And that's me done. I think I'm about on time.
You are perfectly on time, Richard. We do actually have some questions, but again, like before, we can send them across to you to follow up afterwards. So thank you very much for doing your case study today. I think there's plenty to take away from that. You know, not just the power of the technical partnerships, but the power of and the kind of flexibility of SAML. Really, you know, creating user groups and getting that granularity is something you could never hope to achieve with something based on IP authentication. So yeah, I really appreciate your time, Richard. And to all our other speakers, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Lots to take away, and I'm going to hand back to Sophie.